Hello, I see you. It's me, Christi Friesen, and I'm here in my little studio in Maui, and I am ready to share this with you today. This is a fun hot pink pendant made out of epoxy clay and other fun things. And we are going to make it together, and it's going to be such fun. If you have never worked with epoxy clay before, this may be a game changer for you. It is a wonderful material, super easy to use, and if you're coming from a beading place, oh my goodness, it's as if you did bead embroidery with no effort whatsoever. If you're coming from a sculpting area, then it's like creating these things that turn into this rock hard material. It's so much fun. And if you're just one of those crafty people that are looking for new ways to spend money on craft supplies, then I got you covered, epoxy clay. You're going to love it. So come and join me now for a simple, easy, and very emotionally satisfying project. Come on. Here is what we're going to use to create our project. Let me run through those with you very quickly. First and foremost is an epoxy clay. I'm using ApoxieSculpt, which is my epoxy clay of choice. It's a two-part putty that when mixed together will ultimately end in a rock-hard piece, and we'll talk all about that. This is all you really need. This is the 1/10 of an ounce size, and that's about what we use for the project. Gloves to put on your hands, of course, when you're mixing it, spoons to scoop it out with, and a non-stick surface. I'm using a piece of silicone matting, which is what this is right here. You can also use a Teflon sheet, a plastic flexible cutting board, or even some saran or plastic wrap around a tile. All those will work just fine. Then we're going to use some powders. In this particular hot pink design, I've used Neon Princess, which is a pigment powder from my own powder line, but whatever kind of pink you want to use is great. And then I used a cinnamon brown as well. Those are my two choices, but of course you can gear any of your colors and accents to fit your favorite colors if you prefer. Then I used Swelligant, which is from my product line again, and it's a clear matte sealant. We're using that in the glazing process. Any kind of craft glaze will work, and I highly recommend a satin or a matte, not a shiny gloss. But you won't need much of that, just a little. I've got a bunch of ball-tipped head pins. I'm using sterling silver, or at least silver plated. You can use whatever you like. I use silver in this, even though there's gold, because I like mixing my metals, but that's up to you, whatever you like. And I don't know, there's probably maybe a couple dozen at the most, maybe a dozen that I use, but have some on hand. Then for the rest of the accents, I've used an assortment of beads. This is just an assortment of different sizes in the pink and kind of peachy and pink range. I also used some crystals. These are some glass rhinestone flatbacks. These are hot fix, but you don't have to have that. Just some glass crystals will be great. And I also use these wonderful little glass balls, but you could substitute any kind of little round bead or accent like that if you want. That's for the center of the flower, so adjust as you wish. Then this little thing that I moved was a piece of 24 karat gold leaf. We are using that for the gold here in the piece because I love real gold. Nothing looks like real gold but real gold. So that's what I recommend. But if you have gold colored metal leaf, that will also be acceptable. And speaking of films and leaves, I'm using just a little bit of like a cellophane type plastic, you know, like the stuff that you would get wrapped on a gift basket or something. And this has an iridescent finish to it. So I'm using a little bit of that and scissors to cut it with, and they show up in the petals of the flowers. You can tell by that little bit of shine. Wire cutter and pliers are the tools you'll need to cut your head pins. And then other tools that I've used are tweezers to help place all the beads and other things. And I'm using a crystal katana also to place my beads and accents. Any kind of picker up for your crystals and beads will work. I love the crystal katana, but you can use a pickup pencil, which is like a grease type pencil, or you can even put a little beeswax on the tip of a toothpick and use that if you like. Paintbrush, of course, to add our glazes and our powders. And then I highly recommend my Wow It's Awesome tool. This is a stainless steel, stainless steel wrecking ball, apparently. Stainless steel tool, and I love this particular part of the tool because it makes the flower petal pattern really well. But any kind of sculpting tool you have and any kind of a little flat tool that can make some impressions can work. And then finally, I have a little piece of soft flex beading wire, and I've got a little bit of tape on the end. This is to string up some beads, and we'll use them to put lineups of beads in the mix. So there you go. This or something similar is what you need to create our hot pink pendant. So sometimes I like to sketch things out while I'm kind of coming up with the idea, trying to figure out all the bits and pieces and what's going to work. And I did especially with this one because I wanted to make sure that I would use certain elements in the design that I could then find as a kit or make sure other people could more easily get. So I kind of sketched out the idea of this fairly large. Now this isn't obviously to scale. We'll make it bigger because you can see how big the flower is here, and our flower is considerably bigger. So this is a big pendant. And I want to make it have some gold leaf in the middle, a bunch of crystals, some silver head pins, and then we're going to do an interesting little thing with the texture down here and play with it. And I decided I wanted to use epoxy clay for everything. It's an interesting material to use. Not everybody has used it much, and I think it's one of those game changer kind of things that once you start using it, you'll be like, wow, why didn't I use this forever? So I thought this would be a really great way to introduce it to more people that maybe hadn't played with it before. So here's my kind of idea of where I'm going to go, and then we'll just see where the things take me, and we may deviate from this, but it's a good idea to kind of formulate in your head what you're thinking if that's your thing. If it's not, that's okay too. So we're going to use ApoxieSculpt, which is my favorite brand of epoxy clay. I'm using a larger container, but we don't need very much of it. It's a two-part system, and we're going to glove up first to work with our two parts, because once you mix the two parts together, it starts to harden. Well, it doesn't start immediately. You've got an hour or two or more of work time, depending on what you're doing. But eventually, within 24 hours, it hardens to just a rock-hard cement-like thing. It's fantastic. So I'm going to work on a non-stick surface. This is a silicone mat, like a baking, one of those baking mats. You can also use a piece of cling wrap, saran wrap, that kind of thing, or even like one of those plastic cutting boards. Anything like that that will resist sticking to the epoxy clay once it's dry. And it'll be sticky now, but once you take it off, once it dries, it'll pop right off. But anyway, this two-part thing, you're going to glove up, because anytime you're working with a chemical, you want to protect your hands from absorbing a lot of that unnecessary chemicals and minimize your contact always. And since it is two parts, what I'm going to do is just use a plastic spoon and scoop out each of the parts, and roughly about the same amount. I eyeball it. You don't really have to go nuts and measure it and weigh it or anything like that. As long as it looks about equal, it's pretty good. This is not like super sensitive to that. But remember, once you start touching it with your gloves, you can't start dipping back and forth, because you're going to be contaminating the mix. So you want to make sure once you start touching them, you're ready to mix them together. So I would say that those are roughly two equal sizes, wouldn't you? I think that's going to be close enough for our purposes. And I'm going to just mix them thoroughly with my gloved fingers, and smashing and folding and smashing and folding, just to completely mix them. If there is any little streaks showing, that means it's not mixed enough. And you don't have to like rush or anything. Like I said, you've got an hour to 2 hours of working time with this, depending. But I just keep smashing it back and forth and take a look at it all over. I think we're good. Now this one's the white color, and as you can tell, it's not super white. It's more of a, here's white, it's more of a gray white. But I like this color, and it's good for all kinds of goodness. And we're going to create some little teeny flower petals with this. So while my gloves are still on, I think I'm just going to roll a bunch of little balls about the same size for the petals. And then I'll use my fingers to manipulate everything. But while I still have my gloves on, I might as well use them to make up these little balls. And how many petals and how many flowers? Well, that's really up to you. You can modify this little project any way that you desire to make it truly your own. But I would say you want to have usually 5 to 6 petals per flower for this particular kind of design. We're just going to do a simple flower. And I'm going to go ahead and make enough for 2 flowers, although we may only use one of them. We'll just see. I like to have extra. It gives you choices, you know? Okay, now the gloves are going to come off. I've got my little bit of extra. I'll just leave that off to the side. And you can reuse your gloves again and again, so don't throw them away. One thing I suggest is you keep a little wet wipe handy once the gloves come off. That way you can wipe any residue from your hands or your tools. All right, so what I want to do is I just want to roll these out into like an oval. Well, it's a little bit of a teardrop because it tapers down in the, you know, that part of the flower. And I'm just going to make petals. Now the nice thing is this is very soft and sticky, so I can make all the petals right now. We're going to add our film to the surface, and then later on, as this gets hard, if I want to start curving them and giving them some concave bits or you know, a little twist like it's blowing in the wind, I can do that once these start setting up. I can check back in about an hour, and I can check again in 2 hours until it's nice and firm. We'll do that. We'll kind of keep checking back. Now, as you can tell, depending on whether you get more daisy-like or a little bit more cup flower, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I really could use that 6th petal on here. So I might make a few more petals for the next one. I'm not going for any particular type of flower, just a generalized flowerishness. You, of course, can if you want to get your big book of flowers or your Googles out and kind of look at a particular flower and go, ooh, that's the one I want to make. I'm going to make those petals look just like that. That would be just groovy. But I'm going to make a few more petals here. So I have 2 6-petaled flowers. Okay, so now what I have next is just a little piece of cellophane type film with a nice iridescent finish to it. And I'm going to wrinkle that all up, just wad it up nice and tight, and then unwrap this, because that's when it gets magical. Look at that. So you see, you've got all of those little wrinkles, and that's going to catch the light and make it almost dichroic in the sense that it's just pulling light from all over the place. And we want to add that. We want to add that to our flower. So I'm going to start off with just little strips. And you do the wrinkling first. You could cut the strips and then wrinkle them all up, but that's a lot harder. I'll just start with a couple there. And this helps to have some tweezers nearby. Now let's just start adding some to the surface of our petal and see how that would look. And kind of trim it as you go. So I'm just going to press that straight on down. And it almost becomes like a mosaic, because I'll put other little bits and pieces on there. Here's a very thin bit. In fact, why don't we do that? Let's just cut them kind of little different lengths. Some can be small little things like little niblets, and some can be longer. Okay, let's try this. Let's take that little piece here and add it on. So you can fill up every petal as much or as little as you wish. You can make the whole surface covered with this film, or you can have just the stripe down the middle. Kind of play with it and see. I personally think it looks really nice if you add a bunch of different little pieces here and there to fill up the space and have it mostly filled up. And again, you can kind of place something and then trim it as needed. And it can tuck around that back side if you like. You see how well it just grabs to the surface without any effort, just a little bit of pressing and it's on. Let's keep going, shall we? It's looking pretty good so far. This is fun. Okay, so there we have one finished flower, and of course I'll do the same thing over here. Now once we have it like this looks just great. Like I said, you can leave it exactly like this, doesn't have to do anything different, but we can add this wonderful powder. This is called Neon Princess, and it is a wonderful pigment powder in a, obviously a bright neon color. And you could use whatever you like, but I like this. And I'm just going to take a little bit on my brush, and I tend to kind of tap it a little bit here just to make sure it's not built up on my brush too much. And then I'm going to go right in that center and kind of drag it out. That makes it kind of have a little deeper color in the center. And it's mostly going to stick onto the epoxy clay. It's not really going to stick onto that dichro film very much. As you can see, it kind of goes around it. And the nice thing about that is that that makes it really emphasize the film as well. So you could go over the entire petal if you want with that. And, then that film really stands out. Or you can go just the center to give it sort of a nuanced look. This will all dry on the epoxy clay and be nice and hard. So essentially we're making this flower, the petals first, then we're going to impose it onto our larger pendant, or you could make it into a brooch, but this is going to be kind of a large pendant piece. Okay, so now we have our finished flower and our backup flower. I've kind of blown away the extra and just kind of pressed everything down, make sure that it's all attached to the surface. The powders are nice and sort of graduated on there, so you have a deeper pink in the center and lighter as it goes out. And I think we're just going to let these dry, and I'll check back in about an hour and see how firm they are. It'll probably take about 2 hours until they're firm enough to where I can kind of lift them off and bend them a little bit. And then we'll play with it and see if we want to curve them inward, sort of like spoons, or we just want to kind of twist them a little bit like they're blowing in the breeze. Either way could look really nice. Okay, we're going to check in on that later. And then, while that's drying, we're going to get started on the main pendant part. Okay, so I took most of the rest of the epoxy clay from my little 1/10 pound containers, and I mixed everything else up except for about the size of a peanut in each part A and part B. You're going to need to leave that unmixed because we're going to need it later to put the flower on top of our pendant shape. So what I've got is just this nice blob, and I'm going to roll it out into whatever the shape of the pendant is that I've desired. And for me, I'm thinking something more to kind of freeform oval. I'm purposely making it a bit organic, by which I mean lumpy and full of fingerprints. And that is going to be my default shape, something like this. But we're going to need a way to hang it. Now, it's difficult in epoxy clay to get something through here because when you do that, it's going to stick to it. So you could use something like silicone or tubing or whatever, but most of that's pretty big, and then it's hard to make those sides look clean. So instead, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a tool, and I'm just going to start making a little hole in here, and we're going to make this a pendant that you can put like a slip knot up here in the top. And we're going to make that hole be a little part of the design. So again, keep your tools clean. That epoxy clay will dry on there super hard, and then your tool's messed up. So I'm going to make this fun little opening here, and that might look really nice for a slip knot of some kind of a fun cord or a braided metal or some other kind of interesting bit of stringing device here to make that kind of fun. So just kind of play around with that until you like the overall shape. Now, you notice this is a pretty big pendant. This is a statement piece. I want people to, when they see you coming with that on, go, wow, let me take a look at that, and really examine your chest up closely. So that's what I want. It's kind of a big thing, a little free-form shape here that really grabs attention. I kind of like that. Again, if you don't like this, you could leave it completely closed and later on make it into a brooch, although it would be a bit heavy, but you could put a bail type brooch on the back so that you could string it from the back. You You could also use eye pins, and either, I wouldn't put one just in the center unless it was fairly large, but you could put a couple on the side, and then you could string it from the side that way if you like. Okay, so I'm kind of happy with this shape. It's got a nice free-form thing going on here. I kind of like this hole. I think it can be kind of interesting. I've made a lot of like textured dimples on here, which I think will be kind of fun. I think we're good to go. So now I want to start decorating this surface, get it ready for that flower to become sort of the focal point, maybe even 2 flowers. We'll just see how we feel. All right, let's begin. So the first thing I'm going to place is this little piece of 24 karat gold leaf. I love gold leaf. I don't know what's going on with gold, but boy, it tickles me. I mean, it's gold. How can you not love it? But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to chop this little piece into thirds. This is a 24 karat gold leaf, so it's the pure gold, but it's on a, sometimes they call it transfer, sometimes they call it patent, but it's on a transfer sheet. So you can see that it's attached to its sheet there, which makes it a lot easier to use. The loose gold just flies all over the place, and I know there are times when that is necessary, but this is not one of them. So I've cut it into thirds here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to lay this directly on. Now, where you lay it is where it's going to be. So if you suddenly have second thoughts, tough tooties, because that is where it's going to live. And if you have a nice soft brush, then you can push any edges down. And there's going to be a little bit of crackle as it goes up and down areas. That's okay. That's all part of the fun. So don't worry about that. And I'm going to take this one and cut it in half, because one thing about gold leaf is that once you start putting it in place, it has a tendency just for all of the leaf to follow along, whether that's what you wanted or not. And it also can go on top of itself. So if you're piecing it together like I am here, you know, you can just lay gold on top of itself and it will grab, you know, the 24 karat gold will grab nicely like that. So I'm going to just piece this together to make sort of like a band across the piece here. Let's get a little bit more of it over there. And save all those little bits and pieces, because you can just press them onto the surface. No sense in losing them. Although I have noticed that if I accidentally let this gold leaf touch my silicone sheet, it would prefer to attach to the silicone sheet. So that's frustrating. So watch that. Try to keep it right side up so you don't lose it. And then I'm using my tweezers too, so I can, you know, manipulate where I want it to go. Now that time I just took a risk and thought I would just press it on and hope for the best. And then I'm going to take this one and put it right next to it, a little bit there, and press this on here. Now you want to press and not brush, because if you brush, it's very thin. So you're going to start removing some of that surface gold by getting too vigorous with it. So you're basically laying it down just as gently as you can. And again, I'm not worrying about the edges being perfect. I'm doing sort of some transitional stuff here so that my squares go away. You see how I'm doing that? Kind of breaking that up a little bit. And I'm doing that just by laying it on the surface and lifting up quickly, so it can just grab a little, so I get that kind of break apart feel to it. And I'm almost done with my gold leaf, so that is the idea. If you can get this all on there nicely before you run out, that would be the best. Okay, so that is what it is. And my flower is going to be kind of in this area here, so it'll be covering into that gold area, but not in the way of it. Now, we're going to start doing some other texture down here, because we've got a whole different idea to go with down here for texture, but that can wait for a little bit. What I want to play with up here is adding some crystals and some other decorative elements up here to make this look really fun. This is where epoxy clay is like super awesome, because it's a glue that you can just stick things in and they stick. So you're creating these little mosaics. It's almost like bead embroidery without having any of the thread or the sewing. And you can just put things together in the most interesting of ways. So that's what we're going to do next. What I would suggest for this is that if you have some kind of a pickup tool, this one's great, Crystal Katana, to pick the crystals and the beads up and place them. And again, these little teeny tweezers come in super handy. So let's get playing with that now. Okay, so I'm gathering up my supplies. I've got my little pink beads and I've got some assortment of pink crystals. But the other thing I want to use is some of these head pins. So what I've got here, these are just silver-plated head pins. Right here, silver-plated head pins. And I want to go and trim them so that I have a whole bunch that are only about this long. Just like that. In fact, that's almost too long. I want them to be able to stick down into the clay and not poke up, okay? So I need a little handful of those. And I'm going to just trim them all and save the ends because, you know, that's silver and you can use, you know, you can bend these and use them for other things. But we're going to need a pile of those as well. All right, let's begin. I'm going to start by putting things around this area right here. And like I said, we've got a lot of things to choose from. Sometimes it's just easier to kind of dump them out so you can see what you got. There's beads and crystals, and I'll leave those little ones there. And let's just start. So I'm going to start off with a couple of crystals, and I'm going to start close to the hole here. You can go all the way down and around on the inside of the hole. That can look really nice too. Depends on how many crystals you have. But I'm just going to start doing this here. If you don't have a pickup tool like this is a really nice pickup tool. If you don't have one like this, you can get a toothpick and put a little bit of beeswax on the tip. That can work nicely. You don't want much, just a little bit. And I like to have an assortment of, I'm using all pinks here, but an assortment of pinks in different sizes and different shades of pink. I think that always looks kind of nifty. So see what I'm doing is I'm just putting them in place and then pressing them enough to make sure they grab. These are glass rhinestones, and you can get them with the hot fix or without. It doesn't really matter with epoxy clay because you're not using heat to make it grab. It's actually gluing itself in place. Now you don't want to go on top completely of any of the gold leaf because it won't stick. It has to grab the epoxy clay. So I'm getting it right up to, and in that case I overlapped a little, but there was still quite a bit of the crystal touching the epoxy clay, and that's important. All right, so I've got a pretty good arrangement there of the crystals. So I'm going to leave these here. Now with the beads, you can do any number of things here. You can use this tool the same way as you did with the crystals and just start placing them in on their side like that. Or you can pick them up with the tweezers and place them. Or you can string them on a strand of beading cable and make that work in longer strands, which I will show you how to do, because that is a very fun way to insert them into the clay. And I'm doing them mostly on their sides here, but you can also turn them over and do them this way if you want to see that side of it. I'm kind of liking this, just the flat side, not the Fruit Loop side, but that's up to you. Again, it's your design. You can do whatever you want. And again, this is nice to have this assortment of pinks because anything I pick is going to go with it, because I already picked a nice assortment of pinks before we started to look nice together. So it won't matter which ones I place. They'll all look like they belong. Okay, so you see how that's starting to fill up in the area. I'm going to go ahead now and do a little beaded cable so you can see what that looks like. Okay, so what I've got is a flexible beading cable, like Softflex makes. And this is fantastic. I've got a kind of a thin one here, and I've put some tape on the end so my beads don't fall off the end. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the tip with my tweezers, and I'm going to bring all those beads down to the tip so that I can just manipulate them into place. In fact, I'm going to grab that even closer if I can. and just get it right where I want and press them into place. And you want to hold on to it, because if you let go, then all of those beads start getting loose. So once they've tucked into place, they'll be pretty good. And then you just pull that beading cable out. And now you've got this fantastic little lineup of beads. And I'm going to add a couple more to that so that it emphasizes that curve. So I'll do 2 or 3 of them in a row like that, and then I can fill in the gaps with other things. That's pretty fun, isn't it? And sometimes the tool leaves some marks in there. That's okay. You can just come by with additional beads and fill in those gaps, or crystals, whichever you've got handy. I usually wait till everything's done and then go back and fill the gaps, but I thought I'd show you right now how that works. See? Pretty easy, right? Usually just shoving things around seems to work just fine. Let's keep on going. Maybe do another line or 2 of that. But see, isn't that fun how that makes that flow? It emphasizes this sort of circular thing you've got going on as a design element, and makes the whole thing look very connected. Make sure you press those down in once you've taken that cord out of there, because you really want to make sure they're good and firmly embedded. Just laying on the surface is not enough. So before I go any farther, I'm going to start filling in some of these gaps here. Because when you had like when you do a big bead, like these big ones, it kind of shoves some funky space out around the little ones, so they have to get repositioned and like that. See how much of a gap there is there? Got to fill that up. Okay, so I have a few more crystals. I think I'm going to fill them in over here, because this was a lot of crystals on this side, so it kind of goes from bead to crystal, and I want to kind of fill in the rest of that space there. So I don't have as many crystals, but I have more of these glass beads, so I'm going to use those to fill in the spaces. I think that's looking pretty nice in there. You don't have to cover everything completely. Spaces can be left open if you want. We'll put some texture and that sort of thing in there, so don't be afraid of the empty spaces. And also remember that you can have your big flower down in this area. So, you know, as you do your design, keep in mind where your other elements will be, so you don't cover up or put things in an area that's going to get covered up, and therefore you're sort of wasting your elements because they're going to be no longer visible. And if you want to really emphasize the curve, then you keep all of the beads somewhat consistent in size. Obviously, I went to some different sized beads and some different shaped beads, so it fills in this area a lot, but I lose some of the continuity of line, which I'm okay with that. But if you prefer to have that more emphasized line, then, you know, just act accordingly by putting in the beads of the same size. Now, as this epoxy starts to harden, because it starts to set up, you'll notice that it becomes a little bit more push. You have to shove a little bit more to make things stick in there. That's kind of your cue that you need to hurry up and finish, because you're going to run out of sticky. And if you've never done this before, that can be a little stressful because it'd be like, oh no, I'm not done yet. I haven't made my decisions. That's another reason why I like to sketch things out ahead of time so I have an idea of what I'm doing, gather my materials ahead of time so they're all in front of me ready to go, and I don't have to waste time searching around in my studio for, just the right bead. I already have the right bead. It's right there. It's ready. And I'm also saving this area for last because it can be the most firm there because I'm not sticking a lot of things in there. All right, so now I think we've filled up a lot of the beaded area. So we're going to switch over to those little head pins. Now, some of those head pins are going to get used in the flower a little bit later, but the ones that we have here that I've trimmed down real small, these are going to be great to sort of fill in some gaps. I love mixing my metals. I like mixing gold with silver. I am not a purist when it comes to metals. I think you've noticed that lately nobody is. Everybody is mix and matching their metals quite a bit. I think once the cost of gold went so high, people started using alternative things and playing with base metals a little bit more too, like brasses and coppers. I guess they're not really base metals, but the less expensive metals. And then they found, hey, this doesn't look so bad to mix copper and silver. I mean, people knew that already, but it really became a thing here in the last few years. So I am a big fan of that. My motto is just use all the things. I mean, just use whatever you like to make it look good. If you don't like mixing metals, then don't do it. But if you don't mind, like me, then this will be nice. If this bothers you, you could get gold head pins, and therefore you're good. Now, you might not as quickly identify like, oh, that's a little head pin sticking up, but when you look over the whole thing overall, then what you're doing is you're getting this little different kind of texture because these things are sticking up. And the nice thing about them is you just push them in, because the epoxy clay is a glue and it's just going to grab onto that metal. So you don't have to bend the end to make it adhere more. It's fine. You just stick it in wherever you want and it's going to stay right there. And you can even kind of put some on the side sticking out a little like that if you wanted to, for a little bit of more of a texture. I'm going to go ahead and press that in, but you could make them stick out. You could add some beads so that when they stuck out, there was beads on them as well, which could be really cool. But I'm just going to put a few here and there just for some textural elements. And then I'm thinking I'm going to probably put a few more just down in this area as like a transitional bit. And then we'll see if we want to add some more beads in that area too. But for now, let's just put our head pins there. I had that kind of on my sketch, envisioning that there would be, as if you noticed here, some of these sticking up in this area and then kind of coming down here. I like to create lines so that your eye can move in the piece, and it gives, it's kind of cluing your eye where to move. So it's like moving this way, and now it's moving this way, It just, it makes for an interesting piece, I think, when you can have visual movement like that. And I'm pushing them all the way down, so just the head pin is showing. But you can, in fact, let me get a bigger one. You could do this if you wanted to, because this is fun. And this makes a good transition. Like take a bead on your head pin and then trim so that you've got a little bit of a stem there. So you see what you've got there. Actually, that's a little bit long. It'll poke out the back side. Let's try that again. And then you can do that by putting a bead in a head pin. See how that ties those things together, because you're bringing some of that color down here. And it's okay to stick these into the gold parts too, because the stem's going down into the epoxy clay, so it's going to grab without any problem at all. right, so we've got this looking pretty good. Now it's a little empty over here. I'm going to think about that for a minute. And I like the gold just as it is. We could add a texture in there if we needed to, but I think the texture of fingerprints is making me happy, so I'm going to leave it just like that. And then the next thing we're going to do is kind of play with this in here. And I think we'll probably echo the textures here to here, and we're looking pretty good so far. So what I've got planned for this area and a little bit up in here is to create sort of a repeating texture pattern that once it's all dry and hardened, we can use the powders to sort of glaze in that area and make just kind of a little different look. So I'm going to take this tool because it's got kind of a nice rounded bottom. This is my Wow It's Awesome tool, and I love it because it's awesome. And I'm going to just start by making a flower shape by pressing this in little petals. And you might have a similar tool, something that would work for you. And I like to move the piece around instead of trying to move my hand in impossible patterns. So see there, I've made sort of a free form kind of a flower thing. And I'm going to do the same all over here. So I'm just pushing the tip in so that it can make like a pointed little tip. And then you see how it does there? It makes its own little flower shape. So that's going to echo the flower that we're going to put in there. From time to time, wipe the end of your tool. That will keep it nice and moist and clean, which makes it lift off very nicely. If it starts to stick, then you want to wipe it off again because it just means it's getting a lot of residue on there, which is going to make it more sticky, which we don't want. So you see how I'm kind of doing that? I'm just doing one texture on top of the other, finding the empty spot, and I'm starting, I don't want to start here because I want this point part to be in the middle and then it rounds out on the end. Again, this tool is just perfect for this. So I'm imagining where my petal is going to butt up against this, and then that's my center spot. So that might take a little practice. You'll get it. You might want to practice on like a piece of clay, like a polymer clay or something, to kind of get that pattern before you start putting it on your epoxy clay. Because once you start putting it on here, it's difficult at this stage because it's starting to get a little firm. So it does make it difficult to like wipe this all off and start again. So a little bit of practice on another piece of material might be good. So see what we've got so far? When we add the glaze in here, that will just sink down into those deeper spots and look really good. And that's something we do when it's all done and dry. Okay, let's, another one here. Let's do one up here. Again, remember, my petals are going to come up to the edge here, so I'm moving my tool around to accommodate that. Like I said, sometimes you have to turn your brain around, and that can be tricky because, I don't know, I always had trouble with math and geometry and that kind of thing. So, like imagining, you'd think it wouldn't because it's shapes and stuff, but for some reason that was always a tricky one for me. So you're kind of imagining where that flower is going to end, and that's how you're doing it. Now, your big flower is going to cover up some of this area, right? So, you know, just go ahead and put them all over, and some of those will not be as visible because of that. But that's okay. It's an overall pattern, so not a problem. And there's a little bit more here. All right, so now we've got this nice overall pattern on the whole thing. I'm going to repeat just a little bit up here. Again, tying things in. I've got, you know, crystals are covering around in here, beads here, and then beads come down here. You know, the gold is a swipe. These little dots, silver dots, kind of cascade down. So you want to just kind of repeat those sorts of patterns. So I'm going to do that, just that little bit up here. So see how that adds the continuity up there. Let me make sure that that is good. Okay. Good. I think that will look pretty nice. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a little bit of powder in this area to make these set off nicely. And we're going to contrast it from what's going to be going on down here. So that's our next little trick. Okay, so I've got my brush, and what I'm going to do is I'm using a sort of a cinnamon brown here. The reason is that I want to make a color that is going to look good and dark around here so these things can really stand out. But I don't want to use, I could use the hot pink again, but I'm going to have a lot of hot pink in the flower. So let's just get some brown in here. So what I'm doing is I'm getting quite a bit and I'm tapping it in place. Now at first, this is going to cover up everything. And you're going to be like, oh, wait a minute. I can't see any of the pretty colors. Well, don't worry. That all gets brushed off. What this does is it's like, it serves the same purpose as grout in a mosaic. It's in between things to kind of make the design really stand out. So I'm getting it down and around in here, and this is going to just dry right on the surface of the epoxy clay. So I'm just kind of shoving it on. I'm not doing a lot of brushing, as you can see. I'm kind of shoving it into place. So let's get some more here. Kind of come around that side. I don't go on top of the gold leaf. I'm doing a little on the side where there's some gaps because there's little micro cracks on all the gold leaf. So if I go on top of the gold leaf, it will kind of get all over it, and we don't want that. We want that gold to stay nice and shiny. So a little bit where it edges there, but that. So now, what you want to do is you want to brush a little bit off the surface, but not too much, because you want it to dry completely. And when it's all done and finished, we'll wipe that with a little bit of a wet wipe and let everything get all pretty again, but just enough there so we can kind of see what's going on. Okay, I think we're looking pretty good so far. So this is just going to sit and harden. And we're going to come back and revisit these guys, because remember, one or more of these, probably just one, will sit in this pendant. And we're going to want to make sure that we play with it and see if we can curve it around a little bit. But these are just not quite hard enough yet to be able to peel off and work and push on them and have that stick, because they're still too soft. If I pulled this up and bent it, it would just flop back down, you know, because of gravity and stuff. So we'll give that a little bit longer. So this has been about an hour or more in the making, which means these have been sitting here a little more than an hour. They're not ready yet. So we'll check back in another hour. Okay, so I've let some time pass, and now these things all pop up very easily. I've already peeled them off of the piece here, so they pop up very easily, and we're going to twist them. So I kind of experimented with a couple different things. If I push it in like this so that they sit up like this, so they sit up like this, it kind of wrinkles that stuff up a lot, which is okay, but I don't really like it so much. And you can bend it the other way so that they're kind of more curved like a hamburger bun or something. But I thought what was nice is if I just took each one and kind of gave it a little bit of a twist. Just enough to make the petals look kind of alive. I think that will work out nicely. So I try to twist it a little, each one. Well, you can only go one way or the other, right? But try to do it just a little bit differently on each one so it has a bit of variety to it. And if this is stiff enough, it will hold this twist. You'll be able to tell if you look at it for a bit and it just starts going back to where it was, then it wasn't quite hard enough. And you'll have to just kind of circle back around in a half an hour and, you know, refine any of those little twisty bits that need to be fixed. But that should work pretty well. And then you just leave them here and let them dry completely. And then okay, so I've let this dry overnight, and then all I'm going to do is just like peel that right off, and look at how easily that just pops right off. And it does have a little bit of indentations and things on the back. My suggestion is always, if you have more epoxy clay, you can mix up a little bit more and just add a backing on here, very thin, but something just to make that all look nice and finished. That's always a good way of doing it. But anyway, let's play with this now, and let's start adding our flowers on there, because these have all dried nicely as well. and they've retained their nice little curvature, so we can start playing with that and adding it to the surface of this. Should be fun. I'm going to use my wet wipe here while I have a moment and just sort of wipe the surface of the beads and the crystals to take any of that residual powder off and let them shine through nicely. That looks good, doesn't it? I also used it to clean this silicone sheet. I'm going to continue to work on the silicone sheet. Doesn't need it, but it's a nice grabby surface and it makes it easier to work on. So there's a couple things we're going to do now. Is we have some painting to do down here, and then we've got our flowers to add. I think we'll do the painting second. The reason is I really want those flowers to attach onto the epoxy clay really strongly. So I don't want there to be surface paint or anything in the way. So we're going to add the flower and all the details first, and then we'll do our painting last. So remember how I told you to save a little bit of the epoxy clay, each part about the size of a peanut, just a little small peanut. I've mixed those together now, and this is what we need to complete our project. Obviously, gloves and mix thoroughly, no rush. So what I want to do is, most likely I'm just going to go with the one flower. I think that will be enough. And given the way this looks, I don't want to cover up too much of the detail. So I'm envisioning the flower, kind of the center of a flower being here, and it kind of taking up sort of this area here. So I've got probably more of the epoxy clay than I really need, but I'd rather have too much than too little. So epoxy clay sticks onto epoxy clay really well. All you want to do is take that little ball where you envision the center to be, which I'm going to envision right about here. Press that down enough to where it's got a grab. Keep your fingers wiped. And then I'm going to take the petals from my flower here and just gently press them in. Now, when we were doing it, we kind of already knew the parameters of that circle, so I kind of already know how far apart they were. But you might have to do this more than once. You can take it off and put the stuff all back on again if it doesn't go on well the first time. And remember that these petals are all also made out of the epoxy clay. So that means they're going to stick into this new batch of epoxy clay really well too. So everything's just going to stick to each other really nicely without any effort. And since this is just mixed, it's nice and gooey and grabby. Okay, so there is my flower in position, which I think the positioning works nicely. Now we're going to do some fun stuff in the middle. So I'm going to take a little bit more of that clay and just put a little ball right on top because I got stuff that I want to do. Now you notice too that some of this is gushing out the side. At the moment I'm not going to worry about that. Once I've got all the details in, if I can see any of that, then I will fix that. But for now, just something like this is good. I'm looking at my spacing. I think that looks really nice. Now if you wanted to, you've got these other petals. I mean, you could always make a more full flower by putting more in all around, but I'm going to just start with this and let's see where we go. Now, we've got a couple of things I want to play with here. Remember all those little pieces from your head pin that you had left over? Well, these guys bent in half, and I'm going to take my pliers and press that bend so I've got a narrow little wire bit here. Then with my wire cutters, I'm going to get rid of that excess tail. And I've got a little piece like this. I'm going to make a bunch of those, and then we can insert those all around to make like a layer of wire stamen kind of thing. All right, so I'm going to start bending all of these and just start making a whole big, interesting pile of those all around. You can put them side by side. I kind of like to overlap a little bit sometimes. It has a little bit more dynamics, in my opinion, than just all one after the other. So a little bit of overlap. So like this, you can put like a secondary one kind of in the middle. So isn't that kind of fun? That adds another nice little mixed media element to this flower. And I'm keeping it as close to the edge of the clay as I can. Not in the middle. I've got something else that's going to go in the middle. Another thing I like about the epoxy clay is the putty consistency is such that it really helps everything stay where you put it. It doesn't like start, you know, I've stuck them in there so that these petals are sort of sticking up, and they kind of stay that way. Although you can put just a little teeny, you know, wadded up bit of tissue underneath, as long as it's not touching the fresh epoxy clay, and that will hold things in position if you're having any trouble with droopage. Flowers are such interesting things, and there are so many kinds of flowers. And one thing I love about creating sort of a fantasy flower is that there probably is one somewhere that looks like it. So, you know, you don't necessarily have to follow something botanically correct, as it were, because whatever it is you make is going to look very similar to something that exists in the wild. Now, of course you can, if the purity of design and reality is your thing, then by all means follow along a natural pattern that you find, you know, Google it, or you've maybe got photographs or something. That's totally great, but don't feel too hung up on that. I don't think it's necessary. Just enjoy the free form that you get to do by just sort of knowing the basics of flowers, which, you know, we've got the petal, we've got the stamens, which I guess that would be what this is. I'm thinking of things like anemones or whatever that have those little fluffy things, poppies. Some of those flowers have the stamens that are all slithery around the center with the petals around the outside, and I've got that in my brain. So I find it's always kind of helpful if you go do some research and take a look at a few things, so you're not just going by the ones that are stuck in your memory, because, you know, your memory may not be as accurate as you think. So go take a look, you know, wander through Google or wherever, and visit a botanical garden, whatever it takes to kind of look at how the flowers actually look and get yourself some fresh ideas. Okay, so now I think I've got plenty of this business in here. We're ready to start putting something fun in the middle. Okay, I've got these wonderful little glass orbs. A fellow artist, friend of mine, Cheryl Harris, makes these, and they're just little bits of lampwork glass that she's created into these little fun orbs. So there's no hole in it. They're not a bead, although you can totally use beads, but they're just this wonderful little flat rounded bit. It's rounded with little flat on one end bit of glass, and I'm going to just set those in the center here because I think that looks so awesome. Now you could use any number of things in here. You could use beads, of course. You can use more head pins if you want, like putting the head pins here so the little ball part sticks out. If you've got more head pins, man, that's awesome. If you have additional little bits of crystal, like maybe some yellow crystals or whatever, that could look really cool. So just kind of play with whatever makes you happy until you've got a fun little center here. But I'm going to use these because I've got them and I like them. She makes them in all different colors, which has been fantastic for me anytime I'm using this epoxy clay mosaic-y assemblage style, which is sort of what this is. I try to use these little glass balls in there because they're just such fun. All right, so what I'm doing is I'm trying to make a pleasant arrangement so it doesn't look too uniform. That's the problem, of course, with something like this, is that they're going to line up into something that looks very uniform, and I like it a little bit more free form. So I'm going to go back to my beads and just try to use a little bit of bead here and there to fill in the gaps. And I'm noticing that I could use just like a little bit more clay right here in order to make the bead have a place to land. So let's do that. That's why it's always good to have a little bit of extra, because you never quite know when you're going to need it, right? And maybe I'll put a couple of beads right in the center too. So I'm taking the bead and just picking it up so that I can put it inside, sort of sideways. What that does is it breaks up the, like I said, the pattern, the more regular pattern of the glass orbs, so your eye doesn't get too fixated on the pattern and it just sees that nice little cluster in the middle. And see how that kind of breaks it up visually and adds just some little interest there, brings some of that pink color in. I'm thinking that looks pretty sweet. Okay, so I think that's kind of enough. You can add more if you like. I've got a little bit more down in this quadrant than other places, but I'm all right with that. Now I'm going to just take my little tool and kind of fluff up anything that's visible so that it all has a similar texture that looks kind of natural. Now, any of the little extra that's down below, I'm going to just sort of smooth up out of the way so it's not real visible. And I don't have too much that's gushed out there, so it shouldn't be too hard to just make that kind of blend into the background. I think that was about all. All right, so now let's take a look. Does everything look centered? Do all the petals look good? I'm feeling like that's looking pretty nice right there. Now we're going to go back to our powder and add some powder all around this fresh epoxy clay so that it has a nice coloring behind it, just like we did up here. Okay, so this is back to my cinnamon brown, getting some on my brush and just dabbing it. And see how that just sets everything off. I just love this part because you can just, all of a sudden, all those little details that you've added just jump out and look fantastic. They don't get lost in the epoxy. They just are set apart, which I think is just grand. And any kind of chalk powder will work. You can use, I'm using a pigment powder from my Surface Effects line. You can use just like pan pastels I love as well. You can use chalk pastels. You just kind of scratch the surface with a tool so that you get powder, anything like that. You can use mica powders and things like that too with shine. I don't always use shine for coloring, but you definitely can. No problem there. All right, so take a look. Make sure there's no weirdness that you want to fix. And now we'll just let that dry a little bit more before we start playing with this background. So far, so good. All right, we're going to get glazing now. We're going to add some color down here to the raw epoxy. What I'm using is Swelligant Clear Sealant. Swelligant is my product line of metal coatings and patinas and dyes, and of course the sealant, which is just a protectant coating. So just about any kind of craft coating is going to work. I like the Swelligant because it's a matte, almost flat finish. There's like no shine to it. So I can add color and protection without adding shine. Sometimes shine is great. Sometimes that's what you want. But in this particular instance, not really so much. So what I've done first is I've got to shake that all up, and then I've dribbled a little bit in there. And all I'm going to do is get my brush wet. I've got a little water here. Wipe it off on a paper towel so it's damp, but that's all. And the first thing I'm going to do is just put a little layer of the sealant all over the surface of my epoxy clay. And I'm not going to go on top of the gold, although I could. It doesn't need it. You know, I guess it's sort of your opinion on that. The gold leaf can rub off if it gets a lot of wear and tear. So if you would like to go ahead and seal that, you can too. And like I said, any kind of clear glaze will be just fine. I wouldn't go with anything super shiny though. You know, a satin or a matte finish I think is your best bet. And the same thing goes up in here. You don't have to coat this powder, but if you have a big area where it's just by itself and doesn't have any beads and you want to add a little bit of a coating on top of that, you can. But try to keep the sealant off of things like beads and other things. I think it's just better. Also, I might mention that if you want to, you can put some of the sealant on the flower petals. That's up to you. If that's something you want to do, you can. Okay, I'm going to let that dry, and then we'll add the color. All right, now I'm going to mix up my color. So I'm going to put a few more drops of my sealant in here. And I'm going to get my hot pink, because I love that stuff. And I don't want much. I'm going to get just a little bit. Okay, let's see how far that goes, and then we can put more in if we need to. Get my brush wet again so I can kind of water it down just a little bit. So see how just that tiny little bit made a pretty intense color. Now what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start putting this in, and you see how it starts flooding into the deeper areas. So whether that be around these little beads or in the pattern, it's going to flood inside of those. And that's because I've watered this down just a little bit. So it acts sort of like a glaze and kind of goes down in those areas. And I think that turns out kind of nice looking. So it gives everything sort of a pinky color, but it watercolor-esque, glaze, ceramic-y, kind of, that's the kind of look we end up with this. And I think that look is kind of nice, don't you? Okay, let me spin this around a little bit. Let's get some right in here. I'm looking for any area that I might have missed, little gaps here and there. And see where it goes over the gold, it's going to make color on there. So I'm going to wipe that off here. I got to do that fairly quickly because this stuff dries fast. So I'm going to clean my brush and come back and just wipe it off the gold there. Now, if you want it on top of the gold, of course you can do that. Not a problem. I don't really want that, but I want it in between. So I'm going to go back and dab just a little bit here and there. That should be enough. All right, let's take a look at it all over and see. We're going to want that to dry because we may come back and flood it with just a little bit more if it soaks in to such a degree that you don't have as deep of a color as you like. But I think we're looking pretty good with that. Let's just let that dry and see what happens. And there we go. It's all dry. You get a little bit of this kind of shininess down in the cracks and crevices only because there's a nice little pool of it. But doesn't that give it a lovely glazed look, and it just ties everything all together? And you know what? When you weren't looking, I went ahead and put a little glaze on top of that gold leaf to see if I liked it, and it did turn out just fine. So feel free to put a little thin layer of glaze on there to protect your gold leaf if you want to. But there we go. It's ready to be strung up on something very interesting up here, and it's drama time. Wear it and get all the compliments. Wasn't that fun? Fun, fun, fun. Yeah, I knew you'd like it. It's so easy, and doesn't it make you just want to start creating little pendant forms and start sticking all kinds of things on them so that you've got one in every color of the rainbow for every day of the week? Yeah, me too. All right, well, go have fun with epoxy clay. And if you're looking for other projects from me, you can just look on the YouTubes. I've got a channel, obviously, you're on it. And there are other of my videos floating around in different places. You can also go to my ChristiFriesen.com website and find all kinds of tutorials, online classes, creative events, and other fun things. So thank you for sharing this time with me. I hope it will have a lot of happy creating days ahead for you as well. Bye.